Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of Azure on Air. This is Amrita here, and today I have an interesting guest with us. Today we're going to talk about Azure costs with Twan Koot. So, speaking about Twan Koot, he's Principal Expert Azure at Ordina, and he's also interested in speaking about Azure performance and cost computation in Azure. Apart from this, he also conducts a lot of sessions on and Azure conferences, and also he's interested in speaking a lot about Azure, and that's why we have him in our show of Azure on Air today. Apart from this, he's also interested in motorcycles, so I'm very excited to have Twan Koot on our show. Hello Twan.
But Azure, that's like a huge cloud thing, and there's lots of services beneath that. The true power of the cloud is that you're also able to shut down or decrease the machine in terms of sizing, or completely shut it down when you don't need to. And that's where you start saving money. First thing is to look at your workloads and adapt to that. Hi, welcome.
So let's talk about the topic, Tuan. Can you just give us an introduction about why you choose this topic to speak before the audience, that is Azure costs?
Yeah, so it's interesting because late last year, a colleague and I, we discussed something about Azure and quickly came to the conclusion that lots of customers are facing increasing in their Azure bills. So they're facing huge Azure bills, which they didn't expect because cloud is portrayed as cheap and easy to use. What we see is that it's a really hot topic right now, cloud costs and Azure costs in that matter.
Yeah. So like you said, let's have this discussion this way, Tuan. So how do you like to explain this to our audience who are like in the enterprise circle? They would like to know what is Azure cost and how does this benefit their business?
Yeah, so at Azure, that's like a huge cloud thing, and there's lots of services beneath that. And everything in the end costs money. And Azure Cost Management in the end is a part of Azure, part of the portal. It's also an API which you can use to manage your spending, but also save a lot of money or get more insights in what's where you're spending the money on, maybe which team is spending more money than they should be in terms of budgeting, alerting. So that's Azure Cost Management in a nutshell.
So, can you just also highlight about the cost optimization that takes place when you opt for this particular tool available in Azure?
Yeah, so within the portal itself, there's a thing called the Azure Advisory, which is a sort of AI. Well, I wouldn't call that advanced. It's a rule-based system which detects unused services or computing, and it states, well, you have this VM, for instance, which is only utilizing 5% of its CPU, which is a bit of a waste because 95% isn't used. So it would state, well, you can save a lot of money by maybe decreasing the size or maybe shut down the machine. So that's already available within the advisory, but you can do a lot more by taking advantage of the information within the Azure Cost Management.
So, can you also give us some best practices regarding this cost optimization? So, what should be done in specific?
Yeah, so well, that's a broad topic, but in general, if you look at the cloud, and it's which everybody said, it's you are paying what you're using. That's not always true, and there's some trick to that because you might say, well, I've spun up this VM, this virtual machine, and I'm paying, let's say, $500 each month. It's all great. But the true power of the cloud is that you're also able to shut down or decrease the machine in terms of sizing or completely shut it down when you don't need to. And that's where you start saving money. So the first thing is to look at your workloads and adapt to that. When for instance, like take an application for an enterprise organization, which is maybe heavily used during Monday till Friday and in the weekend, and there shouldn't be anybody on the system because everybody is off work, so there would be no usage on the system. So that's a cool case to maybe shut down the machine or even decrease that. Um, and there's where the crux is because when you just use like virtual machines, as I mentioned, it's a bit harder to scale down because machines need to be shut down and it's not instant. If you start adopting like a cloud native development, so start using things like app services or maybe Kubernetes AKS, you're more able to leverage this cloud system by scaling up and scaling down. So that's something to take in mind if you do a traditional lift and shift. You're stuck with the virtual machines you maybe had on premises, and they're pretty expensive in the cloud. So taking the most out of the cloud, you need to switch your architecture, or eventually maybe even the services you use. So switching from virtual machines to app services, or maybe Azure Functions for that matter. So that's something you can do, and there's lots more tips and tricks you can use to save a little money.
Yeah. So that was a good advice from your end, Twan. I would also like to understand. So this is more like a question from my end, because I face customers who are migrating from on-premise to Azure. So for those people, how does this cost Azure cost reflect, or how it looks like? How early should they take forward this cost optimization, or is it too early for them, or should they take it sometime later?
No, you can do it straight away. Like the first thing, if you're going to the cloud, and especially in Azure and on any cloud that matter, I know specifically for Azure, you have different regions. You have data centers all over the world. You may think, well, those data centers are equal. Let's, for instance, have a data center which is West Europe. Maybe it's the same as Australia, but that's not. Every data center is different in terms of compliancy. It's somewhere in the EU, you have some regulations, but also in available services. And so not every data center has every service available. I believe the most availability in terms of services is Central Ohio, I believe. But there's one key other thing which differentiates the regions, and that's pricing. Each Azure region has their own pricing for different services. So the virtual machine or app service you purchase in West Europe is completely different priced in India. So when switching to the cloud, you need to think, okay, which data center do I need in terms of compliancy? So data resistancy, so something like the GDPR. Which service do I need? Do I need the newest available version of particular features, and how much money am I willing to spend? Because different data centers have different pricing. So for instance, in Europe, it's pretty easy. West Europe and North Europe, both in the EU, but there's a 10% price difference where North Europe is cheaper than West Europe. And that's something I use for clients to say, well, if you have a development environment and performance isn't really a thing, just use North Europe because you're saving already 10% on your budget. And the same applies in different regions within Azure. So that's already something you need to think about when going to the cloud. Which Azure region am I choosing?
When you speak about this, I have my next question right on my head. That is, like Azure is built based on pay as you go model, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, how does this work? Or like, what is your take on that when it's going for an enterprise client who has to purchase a lot of Azure resources, and if it's a pay as you go model, how does this work?
Yeah. So in default, there is a pay-as-you-go version. It differs from typical services, but some things are a monthly subscription, other are fixed. But in general, it's pay-as-you-go. That's fine, and that's the most fair usage. So you pay for what you use. And where most companies go wrong is they don't scale down machines, or they don't shut down machines. So they're paying 24/7 for all the resources. And then they come to the conclusion that it's way more expensive than on-prem. But there are more purchasing options within Azure. You also have reservations. You could do 1 year or 3 year reservations, which can be extremely beneficial. So 1 year reservation already can save you upwards of 40% on the pay-as-you-go price. And the trick is you say to Microsoft or Azure, well, I'm planning on using this service or this feature for this year. So I'm committing myself to paying a certain amount of money. Um, you don't need to pay upfront. You can still pay monthly. So that's something a cool trick. And again, for the 3 year, it's a bit tricky, but maybe for enterprise organizations, it's easier to have some capacity or view for the future. They say, well, this system should be up and running for the next 5 years. And you can use the 3 year reservations, which can net you something around 60% on the pay-as-you-go price. So that's already like a huge decrease in costs if you use reservations. And yeah, that's something, it's already for a long time in Azure, but not many customers use it because it's really powerful. So that's already something you can use apart from the pay-as-you-go price. And the last build, oh sorry, yeah. So on top of that, last October, they during Microsoft Build, they announced savings plans, which is a more dynamic pricing model. It's also based on reservations, which you can use to save money. I would say I'm not too familiar yet with savings plan. I've not used it in a customer context, but there's some pretty interesting stuff there. So there are a couple of ways you can pay your resources. So you either reservations or pay as you go.
Now we had a lot talking about how it benefits the enterprise clients and how they can use it. But now just getting down to the small scale business, the small or medium scale business, say take it in terms of SMBs. So how does this Azure and its cost reflect for such business?
Yeah, so for small businesses, maybe they're familiar about running their own systems, maybe in the cellar. It can be pretty tricky to go to the cloud because it's in the end it's an expensive service, but there's a huge benefit. So in terms of security, CI/CD, DevOps, there are plenty of tools, and that's the power of the cloud. So for them, I would oppose to really look at your architecture, adopt a cloud native development mindset, because doing a lift and shift, for sure, you'd be spending more than your on-prem instances. And I do see, and I read a lot of blogs, I see companies switching back to on-prem because the cloud was too expensive for them. And I'm not saying cloud is a silver bullet, but you should also always look on how you use it. And that's always the same. It's if you want to have a small car for in the city, it's not maybe not economical to get a huge limousine. Uses a lot of gas, and maybe a smaller electric car is more better. So it's better for you, or it's a better fit. So it's always what you need to look out for when implementing cloud. But again, the benefit is opposed to on-prem, you can shut down the machine. So you really should be doing that. That's something I don't see a lot, especially, for instance, development environments. I have customers paying upwards of $1 million on development environments just because nobody shuts them down and they're spinning up new versions, forgetting the old one. Yeah, and that's something you also need to take into account is that if you want to benefit the most or start saving money, you should be enabling your developers or development teams the insights in the cost management, and that's very easy. You can do role-based actions on that feature, but having a dashboard next to your monitoring is key to decreasing the cost, because most of the developers aren't aware of how much their work is costing the company.
Excellent piece of advice from you, Tuan. So now I have this question, which is more of an out of some curiosity, right? You might have faced a lot of clients, and would you share one of any interesting scenarios which you can relate to our podcast on Azure Cost?
Yeah, couldn't mention any clients, but something which happened on our own subscription is I made a presentation about this topic, 4 pillars of economic cloud design, with a colleague of mine. And when we applied those pillars, we thought about on our own subscriptions. We said, well, we can save our company more than 100,000 euros a year just by applying the best practices we came up with. And it was like a wake up call. So like we're preaching about cost management and saving money in Azure. And when we look at our own subscription, there's a lot to be done. And that's the trick. You forget really quickly certain machines or certain storage accounts, and you're still paying for them. So that's something you need to take into account. And yeah.
So now coming to the end of my show, I would just have one question for you, one last one. So like I introduced my show to you, this is for the beginners who are listening to the show to understand the topics and um, how it's been reflected in the real time business. So apart from the topic that we spoke today, I would like to get a small piece of advice from you to the people who are beginning with Azure or who are trying to learn Azure. What would be your quick advice for them?
Well, if you want to learn Azure, there's a lot of free stuff available. I've talked about pricing and virtual machines, but there are also dev and test labs which you can use to spin up small environments, which are way cheaper than the normal production-like types of machines. And there is also lots of free tier services. For instance, Azure Functions is also a free tier which you can use without paying any. So there's multiple options to use Azure without spending any money. So if you want to learn Azure, you can already look in the documentation, and there's different options, and you can, again, if you need something which is you need to pay for, just use it for 2 or 4 hours a day, and you will see, for instance, a small machine may cost you like 50 cents an hour. So it shouldn't be expensive if you just use the tips I said. Only pay what you use. So when you're done, shut down the machine or throw it away, and you have gained some knowledge for maybe €1. So that's something you can already use.
So that was a quick advice for the beginners who are listening to our show. It was really a great session with you, Twan. Very crisp answers and very clear perspectives that you fed on us, and it was an amazing. It was amazing talking to you as well, and I hope to have benefited our audience a lot. And thank you a lot for joining us, Twan. We're looking forward for more recordings with you.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me, and it was a pleasure to share knowledge about Azure.
Cove.co